Science and faith, friends or foe, is our topic for this evening, as you know, and so let's launch right into that. Sociologically, of course, there are plenty of people around today who think that, indeed, they are not friends at all. They're actually foes. You know, if you've gone back to be a student in the University of Cambridge in about 1850, let's choose that date, if you can imagine yourself back then all of the fellows of your colleges or your college would have been ordained members of the Anglican Church. All your science, if you're doing some science or medicine, it all would have been taught by Anglican clergy. And so the way they would have taught it would have been within the framework of natural theology, the idea that you can learn something about God from looking at the world around you. But the Origin of Species, 1859, Charles Darwin has been called by one writer the last great work of natural theology, Victorian natural theology. Now, clearly, you know, that kind of sort of happy, you know, friendly relationship between science and religion is no longer with us, let's be honest. And often today, of course, we have a public perception, at least, that science and religion are in some kind of conflict. Now, let's just think, in a moment we'll think about why that is the case, but just for the second, let's just think about why it is that this sort of conflict thesis, as it's often called, is kept alive. I want to suggest there are two main groups who are keeping this whole idea of the conflict thesis alive. Well, of course, we have to have one compulsory quote from Richard Dawkins. Here it is. The conflict thesis expressed very clearly by him, and I quote, "I pay religions the compliment of regarding them as scientific theories, and I see God as a competing explanation for facts about the universe and life," close quote. So here we have an account where really science and God are sort of seen as offering rival accounts for the reality around us. And Dawkins, as you may know, is not the only person in Oxford who holds to that kind of view about science. Here's Professor Peter Atkins, who was the Emeritus Professor of Chemistry. Those who've done undergraduate chemistry here will probably have had a textbook by Peter Atkins, very good textbooks actually. But he advocates the omnicompetence of science and believes, and I quote, that science with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence should be acknowledged king, close quote. Science, says Atkins, has never encountered a barrier that it has not surmounted. So here we have a kind of very triumphalist view of science. Science is going to tell you all that you need, and you don't really need to bother with other forms of knowledge like religious knowledge and that sort of thing. And of course, there are many scientists who, even with our current limited knowledge, wish to claim that the descriptions provided by their particular discipline are really the only sort of knowledge that you require. So we have the late Francis Crick writing that the astonishing hypothesis, the title of a well-known book that he wrote when he was still alive, he says the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So what do we see here? We see a science that basically has all the answers, and furthermore provides the only really reliable type of knowledge that you're going to come across. And also the claim therefore at the same time is that therefore science must be in conflict of some kind with religion. Now, to keep any kind of conflict going, you need obviously an opposite pole. The opposite pole is provided by various religious folk, often very well-meaning, but whose theology brings them into conflict with science. And I guess that happens particularly in the United States, not entirely, but perhaps the United States is the most famous place where this sort of thing happens. Actually, the data, when you look at it, is a bit more complicated than you might think. I've just shown there a histogram from the Pew Forum, which does a lot of sociological analysis of various populations around the world. And this is a very interesting analysis of the attitudes of Americans, in fact, towards science and religion. And this histogram shows the percentage of Americans who think that there is a conflict between science and religion, and as you can see, the percentages are quite high. But the reason I'm showing this, I think the interesting bit is that it's actually the non-religious cohort, those who hardly ever go to church or never, seldom or rarely attend a religious service of any kind, they're much more likely, the 73%, to think that science and religion are in conflict compared to the most religious, those who go to church every week, for example, of whom 50% think there's a conflict. So there's a kind of disparity there, which I think is quite interesting. But there's no doubt at all that there are subsections of the American church in particular, and a smaller subset of the church in this country, whose views about evolution and so on will bring them into conflict, and it all helps to keep that kind of conflict idea alive. So on one side you've got conflict kept alive by scientists who are claiming too much for their science, and if you like on the other side you have religious believers, I think, claiming probably much too much for their theology and so forth. Along with that, and mingled in with all that, there are of course the occasional ethical issues. We had one in this country some years ago about stem cells, which is now I think over. That's still a very live point of discussion in the United States and so forth. And often these get tangled up with religious questions and so forth. And in some cases they do contribute to the idea. So religion is holding back science, holding back technology. And so we scientists in the scientific community, we should do without that because it's sort of not helping us to get on with our work and so forth. Now, that's the sort of, I painted a very graphic overview there, somewhat simplistic, but just to kind of kick off our thinking about this issue. I want to give you 3 reasons this evening why I think the conflict model, for me anyway, really does lack plausibility. When I'm talking about the conflict model, it's the language used by historians of science, but this overall kind of overarching idea that science and faith are in some kind of intrinsic conflict, okay, often called the conflict model. As a grand narrative, if you like, as a way of describing a relationship, I think it's implausible. I'm not saying, of course, there have been clashes between science and faith over the years at various times and so on, but as a grand narrative, as a generalization, for me, I think it lacks plausibility. So here are 3 reasons. I think the first idea, the first reason why is, it seems to me quite false actually, is simply because Christians were very involved in the emergence of modern science, modern European science, in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular. Now, I'm sure, as you know, the 9th to 14th century was a great era of Islamic science, the Golden Age. Of course, we have Greek science, so you've got lots and lots, a whole stream of thought involved in the emergence of what we now call modern science. There's no doubt at all that from a European perspective, for the early modern period, the emergence of modern science came out of a theological worldview, the so-called scientific revolution. Science is to Christian faith, I would want to say, as cricket is to Britain or baseball is to America or something like that. It's where science has its roots. And, well, I've put up there, you might not be able to see them because of the lights, but there's a whole range of natural philosophers, as scientists were called in the 17th century and later, of Christians who are, many of them, household names, who helped to found the disciplines that we now practice in modern science and so on. People like Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, astronomers like Kepler, Galileo, naturalists such as John Ray, Linnaeus, and people like that. Many natural philosophers involved in the physical sciences, people like, of course, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, after whom our own institute in Cambridge is named, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington. I mean, you could just go on with hundreds of names. And I'm mentioning these names because these are people who have profoundly deep religious beliefs, who fortunately for us wrote a lot about their religious beliefs and how they related to their science. I think of my own laws of inheritance, upon which all my research was based. I closed my lab down a few years ago. All our research is based upon the laws of inheritance, well, as we know, worked out by an Austrian monk, Gregor Mendel, in the garden of his monastery and so forth. So the roots of science are deeply back in these sorts of people. And much of the motivation of these early scientists to explore the properties of the universe came from their Christian faith. Because if you believe that everything that exists ultimately exists through God's creative power and his say-so and so forth, then this gives an incredibly powerful motive to explore the properties of God's universe. So Christians who are scientists see that exploration as part of their worship, now as in the 17th century. Go back to founders of the Royal Society. back in the middle part of the 17th century. They're largely religious believers, many of whom understood the goal of the scientific enterprise just the way I've just said, as uncovering the works of God in creation. Here's a 1663 charter of the Royal Society. It declares that its activities shall be devoted, and I quote, to the glory of God the Creator and the advantage of the human race. Its officers were required to swear an oath on the holy Gospels of God. So Bishop Thomas Sprat was the Royal Society's first historian. They got their history going pretty early then. This is before they entered the 17th century. And he noted in his history that the experimental study of nature was really a form of religious worship. Now, as I say, fortunately for us, they didn't have email. That was good. They wrote a lot of stuff, and they wrote a lot about how their faith, as I say, motivated their science. One of the key founders of modern astronomy, as I'm sure you know, we've mentioned his name already, Johannes Kepler, wrote that I had the intention of becoming a theologian, but now I see how God is by my endeavors also glorified in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God. Astronomers, wrote Kepler, are the priests of God, called to interpret the book of nature. In Cambridge, we had the very young John Ray, came up as an undergraduate, I think age 16, to Trinity College. They started them young in those days. And there he is doing his natural history, later on becoming a fellow of Trinity, soon afterwards, writing one of the foundational works in the history of the history of biology, called The Wisdom of God, manifested in the works of creation. And John Ray chose, in fact, to give some of his lectures in the Trinity College chapel, because he said it's part of worship to actually understand, this wonderful creation in which we live. And it's just as religious to talk about science right here in the chapel as it is to sing matins and have the choirs there and all this sort of thing. So the point here is these early natural philosophers really didn't see any separation between their science and faith. In the 19th century, just to leap on upwards a little bit, we come to Clerk Maxwell, founder of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, a very intensely personal Christian faith, very happy to have the words of Psalm 111 verse 2 inscribed in Latin above the doors of the old Cavendish as it was being built during the early 1870s. If you walk down the right road in Cambridge, you can still see it. And when the old Cavendish moved to its new site, the so-called New Cavendish, the words were then moved, as it were, with it, except this time in English. So every physicist in Cambridge, as they go into work every day, under the door of the New Cavendish, they read, "The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein." So no historian of science takes the conflict thesis seriously today as an overarching model to explain or to describe the historical relationship between science and religion. And this is why, one example, a historian of science here, Stephen Shapin from the University of Chicago, he writes in his book, The Scientific Revolution, in the late Victorian period, it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion and to presume that these two bodies of culture must always have been in conflict. However, it has been a very long time since these attitudes have been held by historians of science. Okay, so I think personally, when I read the history of science, I think the conflict model simply lacks plausibility because of such historical data. Now, secondly, at a closely related point, I think, I want to suggest to you that it lacks plausibility because the very ways and methods of doing contemporary science, many of them, when you track them back, again, have very deep theological roots. And I think it's quite interesting at this stage just to put up there on the screen 4 characteristics of modern science that I think have been nurtured, and historians of science claim have been nurtured by these very deep theological roots. First of all, the one we've already talked about, this motivation to explore the properties of the universe, as I say. If you believe that everything is holy, as it were, everything is made by God, everything is part of his created order, the whole of the creation, then you really want to understand it. You really want to find out how it works and so forth. And you might think, well, it's obvious. Well, it isn't obvious actually, because a lot of countries in the world even today are not that interested in science. Just think about it. Why is that? Historically, they just weren't. They weren't curious. They really weren't interested enough to take part in the scientific enterprise. So why is that? And so forth. Second, the universe is rational and intelligible, and therefore amenable to scientific explanation because created by a rational God in this worldview. Now, here's Isaac Newton writing in perhaps the most famous book in the whole of the history of science, the Principia Mathematica in 1687, writing that the most beautiful system of the sun, the planets and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Even a skeptic like Voltaire, who was a deist, he was certainly very bitterly opposed to institutional religion, and yet a great enthusiast of Newton's views, and he said in the popularized version in French of Newton, and I quote, that the entire philosophy of Newton necessarily leads to the knowledge of a supreme being who has created everything and arranged everything freely, close quote. So everyone in that era who really was trying to understand the cosmology just saw it as orderly because rooted in the orderly mind of God. And I think that raises sort of an intriguing point, really, that science can't really explain itself. I think many scientists don't realize they have to take on board a whole range of philosophical assumptions before they can even begin in the scientific enterprise. And you have to do that. You have to, as it were, take them by faith because science itself actually cannot demonstrate that these assumptions are true. For example, you need faith that the universe is comprehensible, that it's coherent, that it's possible to understand it. And I think we all know that Einstein made so many quotable quotes. I think very often he just said things so they'd be quoted in 100 years' time. But I'm sure you've heard this one when he said the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. But there's actually a very profound truth in that quote. You know, why is it that we live in an ordered, comprehensible world? And then third, there must be laws, these early natural philosophers inferred, whereby God rules over the universe. And there's no doubt at all that our modern concept of laws, which is so deeply embedded in the whole idea of the scientific enterprise, has deep theological roots, and you find this especially in the writings of René Descartes, Robert Boyle, and also in Isaac Newton. And again, the idea was, just as there is a moral lawgiver who establishes laws for the universe morally, therefore, ergo, there must be also scientific laws that are out there, as it were, waiting to be discovered, rather like a lost continent that you would go out and find. And then fourthly, Christian faith nurtured empiricism, the experimental method, well, of course, without which there would be no experimental science, no modern science. And historians have pointed to a number of different ways in which that works. I'll just pick out one of them in particular. Historians would say, well, it's the idea of the contingency of God's actions which encourages an empirical attitude towards the world. In other words, putting it crudely, the God of the Bible can do what he likes. And the only way to find out what God does is to do experiments, to, Francis Bacon called it torturing nature, rather graphic imagery, in the sense that, and what he meant by that was you can't just infer the properties of the universe as the Greek philosophers thought by a long chain of logical deductions. You've actually got to do experiments. So some of the properties of the universe are really weird. Quantum mechanics is really weird. You'd never guess it. You just have to do experiments if you want to find out how it works. And that point was made again way back in the Principia again, this time by Coates in the preface to the second edition of the Principia, in words clearly approved by Newton himself, who definitely approved of anything that came into print with his name under it. But Coates writes, without all doubt this world could arise from nothing but the perfectly free will of God. These laws of nature, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, but learn them from observations and experiments. Okay, that seems pretty obvious to now, especially if you're a scientist. It wasn't really that obvious before the scientific revolution took off. It took a while to get empiricism embedded into the scientific method. So, the motivation to explore the universe, the belief in a rational and intelligible universe, which is even worth exploring, the existence of scientific laws, the importance of doing experiments, empiricism. All these aspects of the modern scientific enterprise have very deep theological roots. And as I say, I think most scientists today are probably unaware, actually, of the roots of where science comes from and quite unaware of the theological roots which have led to some of these aspects of science today which we just take for granted. And probably scientists today unaware of the fact that the word scientist was invented by a Victorian cleric, William Whewell, Master of Trinity College, 1834. William Whewell loved inventing words. I just think of him in the Master's Lodge at Trinity. Just physics, he invented the word physicist, he invented that word. Anode, cathode, scientist, all invented by this Anglican cleric. Okay, so even the label that we scientists have was given to us by ordained member of the Church of England. Okay, now in this country at least, science and theology were seen as pretty good friends until well into the latter half of the 19th century. And that's no longer the case today. Okay, so what happened? Now, some people think it was all about Darwin. Actually, I don't think most historians see the idea of conflict coming out of Darwinism in particular. I mean, Darwin, after all, was being taught in my university by all these Anglican clerics, you know, within a few years of the publication of The Origin of Species and so forth. And in the first half of the 19th century, Anglican clerics still dominated the teaching of science in this country and so on. But when you get to 1900, you find much less emphasis on the tenets of natural theology. You find people much more likely to practice science as a profession. The government was putting more money into scientific enterprise. Scientists got their name. They gradually took on board this new language of being a scientist. They hadn't had that before, and so forth. And so it's been convincingly argued, I think, by historians that this kind of transition to the professionalization of science was actually what led to the parting of ways, really, between science and religion. Science just ended up being a separate activity from divinity down the road, and so it went its own way. And I think scientists, to a large degree, then in the 20th century, kind of lost the art of even, you know, knowing about theology or talking to people who are interested in theology. So, parting of the ways, possibly the major role, the major factor in the so-called model of the conflict thesis. Now, of course, professional separation doesn't, of course, imply necessarily conflict. I mean, ironically, the third reason why the conflict model, I think, lacks plausibility is the present composition of the scientific community. Because if the conflict model was plausible, then you would expect to find some sort of negative correlation between the activity of doing science and religious belief. But data from the USA, at least, suggests that belief in a personal God who answers prayer has been pretty steady, actually, amongst the scientific community over the course of the 20th century. Now, this guy, James Luber, was a psychologist, 1916. He had read people's predictions that as science education in America increases, then the level of kind of religious belief in the scientific community would go down. So I thought, well, that's quite interesting. Why don't we measure it? And so he did this kind of randomized survey, one of the earliest types of randomized survey actually in the literature, where he asked randomized people from the scientific community, you know, do you believe in this personal God who answers prayer? At that time, 42% said yes, and around, 42% no, and then the rest don't know, and so forth. Now, a couple of historians, Ed Larson and Mary Whitten, in 1996, thought, hey, this is interesting. Here is a prediction made by a psychologist in 1916. 1996, why don't we do the same thing? Why don't we ask the same questions to the scientific community and see what's changed? And these are results published in Nature in 1996. In this case, 39% said yes, 46% no, possibly a slight difference there. No definite opinion about the same. Probably within statistical, bands of error, I suspect. In other words, I mean, it doesn't seem to suggest there's been some major, giving up by the scientific community of religious belief in a randomized samples of the scientific community over that period. Now, lots of other data as well. We can talk about that. It's definitely a more complex picture than that one. But it seems to me that it doesn't suggest there's any necessary incompatibility or intrinsic lack of religious belief among scientists in the scientific community as compared to the general population. When I think about the science departments at Cambridge, they're the places where there are religious believers, much more than the humanities actually, if you just think about faculty, professors and so on. So, something to think about there. Okay, now a question is then, well, if that's the case, are the ways in which, and if we think it's a good idea to maintain a friendly relationship between science and faith. I personally think that is a good idea for all kinds of reasons. How do we do that? Well, I want to suggest a kind of model here, which I'm going to call the complementarity model, to sort of think about the ways in which we relate scientific knowledge to other forms of knowledge. Let's imagine that the whole of life, this book of life, if you like, is like a cube, and it's sliced into many different layers. And each layer represents one particular way of addressing, understanding, examining the world. And so we have many, many layers, obviously. I'm not putting these in any order of importance, but you had to put them somewhere in a static model like that. Okay. So in reality, reality is one reality. Okay, it's just one book, if you like. But none of us are up to the Herculean task of examining and understanding the whole world and all its reality at one go. So we have to sort of think about it in these layers, if you like. So here we have the scientific understanding, where we're asking these mechanistic questions. How does it work? What are the mechanisms? What are the generalizations we can make about the properties of matter? You know, all the kind of big scientific questions and so forth. And then we have other layers. We've got the ethical level. We've got the question of, well, what ought we to do in the world? How ought we to use this new scientific data? Ought we to use CRISPR-Cas genetic engineering technology to modify the human genome, for example, and so on? Lots and lots of ethical questions, which, as it happens, science itself, by itself, are unable to answer. A different kind of level of looking at the world. We have the aesthetic understanding of the world. All the arts, humanities, we're thinking about what counts as beauty in literature, and in poetry and in novels and so on. And then we have our personal knowledge that's unique to us, that we cannot publish in scientific journals, and then they won't take it. And that's the most important knowledge to us, our biographical knowledge of the world, which we accumulate over life and so on. And that's, again, very distinct from these other levels. Then we've got these religious questions. Why is there a universe anyway? What breathes fire into the equations? This all Stephen Hawking type of question. You know, is there a God? What's the point? Is there a purpose in life? And so on. The big philosophical, big theological questions. The point about this model, of course, is that these levels of description, these narratives, are in no necessary conflict with each other. They're complementary with each other. We need them all to do justice to this complex reality that we call life. Now, of course, there's always a danger in a static model of thinking, oh, well, they're all isolated from each other and separated out. So we'll put some yellow arrows going up and down and interdisciplinary research and so on. And this is the sort of thing, obviously, that we in the Faraday Institute are interested in. How do these different narratives relate to each other, including science, including religion, and so forth? And if you think about it, I mean, this is the way that our universities are structured in this sort of way. We have different disciplines, different departments, and each discipline has its own particular way of justifying its beliefs. Legal people justify their beliefs in certain ways. Does it overlap with science? Yes. Is it distinct? Yes. Historians have their way of understanding the world. Does it overlap a bit with science? In some ways, yes, but it's very distinctive, and so on. So we have very many complementary levels of knowledge that we have to build up in order to get sort of a bit of a grasp, really, on what's going on. Now, of course, the problem is if somebody, and usually it is a scientist, I have to say, on one level claims that my level of description, you know, is the only one that counts. And we've already mentioned Francis Crick earlier on, who claims, you know, that your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of this vast array of neurons and so on. It's always interesting, always look out for the words nothing but or no more than, because they flag up this fallacy, I would want to call it, of nothing buttery, as it's been called, more technically known as ontological reductionism. Okay, much more boring, really. Nothing buttery is a much nicer phrase, but the whole idea there, of course, is that once you've got the components of the system sorted out and you've made a description of them, there's nothing but, you know, that entity, whatever it is, that's all it is. That's nothing but that, okay. Now we have to distinguish very carefully between ontological reductionism and methodological reductionism, which is fine. That's the method we use all the time in the sciences, and mending your bike and your car. If you want to find out how it works, take it to bits. Hopefully put it back together again. You know, that's how we find out how things work. But that's very different from ontological reductionism, which is riding on the coattails of methodological reductionism and is saying, actually, that's all there is. Okay. Now, I think the complementarity model, it's not the only model about the relationship between science and faith, but I think it can be very helpful in thinking about the relationship between different entities, and the classic one is brain, mind, and social interactions. So there we have our brain with its billions and billions of synaptic connections and so forth. We can give the it description. I can give you an it description in principle of your brain, let's say as a neuroscientist, and you can of mine and so forth. And that's a very important description if we want to understand the science of the neurosciences. But I think we all recognize at the same time we have the language of mind, we have the I language, the personal language, my personal biography, and we know that that's closely related to brain language. We don't know exactly how to translate between it language and I language yet. Maybe we will one day, not yet. But it's a complementary narrative. We don't put mind language in some sort of conflict, with brain language. That would be crazy. And then, of course, we have the personal biography. We have the language of social interactions, and that's another complementary form of language that comes out of mind. So that's just one example, I think, of the way in which thinking about complementary narratives can be useful. They can be useful also thinking about, let's say, this whole issue of creation and evolution. So I'm an evolutionary biologist. I describe the evolutionary history of how biological diversity comes into being, and that's a wonderful scientific description and so forth, asking the question, well, how did it happen and so forth. But I think the theological description would want to say, well, why does that whole process exist? What's the point? Why? So the why question is very dominant, and I'm not trying to split why and how completely into two halves there, but simply the dominant question in the theological narrative is why is it there? What's the purpose? So again, I would want to say these are complementary narratives. We need them both to do justice to this complex thing we call biological life. I actually think that most scientists, not all, but I think most scientists probably hold tacitly or overtly to a sort of complementary understanding relationship. And here's one example: Lord Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal, who was the president of the Royal Society, emphasizing that science really doesn't have all the answers. He's writing here as an atheist, by the way, so this is perfectly normal amongst atheists as it is amongst religious believers, when he writes that the preeminent mystery is why anything exists at all, what breathes life into the equations and actualize them in a real cosmos. Such questions lie beyond science. They are the province of philosophers and theologians, close quote. So you've got tacit recognition. There are simply some questions that science is not going to tell you, and you better go elsewhere if you really want to tackle these effectively. And I think the complementarity model also reminds us of what scientists are actually doing when they do their science within the sort of theistic framework that I'm suggesting to you. Well, I certainly think they're exploring the properties of God's world, because there is simply nothing else. There's nothing else there. That's existence. So what else is there to study? And so if we go back to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and indeed before him, then we find his idea of God as the primary cause, the one from whom all ultimately comes, but working out his purposes in this universe through the secondary causes, those mechanisms that we study as scientists. So science is about studying the secondary causes, if you like. We can't study God through science, that's impossible, but we can study the secondary causes whereby God brings about everything that exists in this universe. And that's the reason why the sort of God of the gaps argument, you've probably heard this argument, the God of the gaps argument is so unsatisfactory from lots of points of view. Okay, so here we have a sort of Swiss cheese over here on the left-hand side, which represents scientific knowledge. Okay, it's got lots of white holes in it. Each white hole represents a current gap in our scientific knowledge. And of course, scientists are very happy about lots of gaps, otherwise we'd be out of a job. Okay, so those are pretty important. And the job of science is to fill up those gaps. The trouble is when some religious believers, sometimes an atheist actually, comes on and says, well, actually, God is located within these little white holes. That's the mystery. God is all about mysteries, you see. And that's why it's called God of the gaps. And the problem is, well, theologically, it's very unsatisfactory. If you go back to Augustine in the early part of the 5th century, he writes, nature is what God does. Well, okay, that's the sort of view of creation that I've been presenting to you. Nature is what God does. This is the created order around us. That's what it is. So from that theological perspective, the fact that I'm currently ignorant, or we as a scientific community are currently ignorant about how something works, is neither here nor there. It's amazing how many people work God in the origin of life. It's just we don't understand it very well. But if you think about it, that's a crazy argument, really. That here in the year 2016, we're trying to infer the existence of God from something just simply because we don't understand it. It's a very odd argument if you start analysing it. Theologically, also, it's very unsatisfactory because the whole of the universe is God's universe in his theistic picture. By the way, when I read the writings of Richard Dawkins, and by the way, I really enjoy his writings about evolution. I don't enjoy so much his writings about philosophy and theology, but to be honest. But when I read his writings about theology, I think, the God that Dawkins doesn't believe in, I don't believe in that God either, actually. It's like a sort of God of the gaps. It's when you actually read a lot of his stuff. So I'm an atheist also in relation to the God that Dawkins doesn't believe in, if that makes sense. Okay, but that's all to do. That's all to do with this image. Okay, I'm not trying to score points. I'm just pointing out, the God of the gaps is deeply embedded in the writing of some Christians and the writing of some atheists. It's there all over the place, and I don't think it's very good. Okay, so I think we should be able to do without it. Okay, so just to recap then, so far we've said that historically science and faith have been far more friends, I would want to suggest, than they have been foes. We've also pointed out the scientific enterprise has been nurtured and shaped by theological considerations. We've also claimed that the language of faith is complementary to that of science, is asking different kinds of questions, so there's no intrinsic conflict in that. And I guess the question now is, can we say more than that? And I think, actually, yes, we can. And just the last, it'll be 10 minutes before our tea break, okay? We're just going to think a little bit about some of the similarities between science and faith in contemporary scientific enterprise. Okay, and I made a list of them here, and we're not going to talk about all of them, you'll be glad to hear. 9 of them: commitment, coherence, compactness, simplicity, elegance, compactness, simplicity, elegance. I put all those as sort of all together, really. Evidence, falsifiability, prediction, further explanation, intuition, the whole rows of them, actually. Those are 9, and I just want to pick on, I think, 3. We'll just have time, just have a quick look at 3, okay? And here's the first one. So I think between the scientific enterprise and the enterprise of faith, there is a common shared commitment to the search for coherence. There's a quest for coherence, if you like. In science, how do we make sense of the data? Mathematical physicists are famous for their addiction to theories which they believe on the grounds of their elegance, their coherence, long before any empirical data is around to support their theory or not, one way or the other. And Einstein, again, was one of those. He wasn't at all impressed by the experimental confirmation of his theory. He once remarked, and I quote, "I do not by any means find the chief significance of the general theory of relativity in the fact that it predicted a few minute observable facts, but rather in the simplicity of its foundation and in its logical consistency," close quote. The equations are beautiful. It's got to be true, okay? And if you know the history of this, it was many decades really before Einstein's theory finally received strong confirmation. I think the strongest probably came in the discovery of the gravitational redshift in 1959. Now, in the more biomedical sciences, the sort of stuff I'm more used to, wet lab stuff, okay? It's really hard to publish your results. Well, it is in any science, but in my science certainly is the case. You've got all kinds of bits of data start accumulating in the lab, by different people. And you can't publish them if they're all just bits of data. You've got to have a story, you've got to have a narrative. And it's very frustrating actually if you're doing research. These bits can hang around for ages. You really want to make sense of them all and hook them up. And then finally, one lovely Sunday evening in the bath, you have this great thought. Okay, it doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen in the shower, I don't know why, but in the bath. And you're relaxing quietly, and then suddenly you have a model, a theory that suddenly sort of joins up all these data and makes sense of them into a rational story. So coherence, of course, is not the only criteria of truth when it comes to scientific claims, but it's pretty important. If something's not really coherent, you're not going to believe it, and neither are your readers in the scientific journal. Now, of course, in making these comparisons, that's in science. Okay? Now, what about how do we go about that sort of thing in the wider realm of knowledge, faith, and so forth? I want to suggest actually we have a sort of similar approach to some degree. I want to imagine now we're sort of testing metaphysical models. Okay, there aren't many actually. If you think about it, you've got the idea of atheism. There's nothing beyond matter and energy. That's it. Period. You've got the idea of Christianity, for example, personal God who's got intentions and purposes for what's happening in the world and for the universe and so forth. There aren't many others. Okay, I've just stuck up two there. Okay, now how do we go about the process of weighing up? Which of these sort of worldviews, if you like, are more plausible? And my suggestion is that in this big circle sort of represents, one of these worldviews and so on. My suggestion is just throw everything in the middle there. That's why we put history, music, and art, and religious scriptures, psychology, whatever you like. Stick it in politics. Okay. Even put Trump in there if you really want. Depending you want, stick it in there. Okay. And then we look at the world and we look at our own experience. And in practice, what we're doing really is saying, hey, which makes more sense? Does the universe that I see and I experience, what is most coherent really in terms of the starting assumptions of these worldviews? And this is the way science works, of course. You're thinking, well, what data makes sense in terms of theory A or theory B or theory C? And that will weight you to favor theory B because it makes all that data more coherent. That's why evolution is so brilliant, because it makes so much data coherent. Okay, that's why it's gone on for more than 150 years. Most theories don't do that. They kind of collapse along the way somewhere. But in terms of metaphysical theories or worldviews, I think this is a way that we can go. Now, obviously, we're never ever going to get total coherence in this life. We are not going to get that. Let's be quite honest about that. But I think it can get us somewhere. I think it can be a helpful approach. And so what we notice is, this second quote really, I think, from Dawkins, whose own atheism suggests that the universe we exists have precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Well, that's quite robust. I always think written on a rainy day in Oxford, possibly, because it's a bit of a gloomy philosophy, but if you're starting with atheistic spectacles on and being honest and just looking at what you see, I think I agree. I think that's really right. That's right. Well, here you have the rival metaphysics of Christian faith, where we've said we've got the understanding of a created God who has purposes and intentions for the universe. It's a universe that the astronomer Paul Davies, cosmologist rather, Paul Davies, a person, by the way, of no particular personal religious belief, but he sort of says, well, it looks like the universe was waiting for us in terms of its properties, the universe with its 10 to the 22 stars that we now know actually has to be that big in order for there to be time and so on for intelligent life to emerge. If the universe had been any shorter, then there's simply we wouldn't have the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, that stardust of which we are all made. So as we look at the planet, we have a striking increase in biological complexity in evolutionary time from 3.5 billion years ago to the present time. We have the emergence of conscious persons in the universe with minds sufficiently rational to investigate its properties. I think that's a profound fact. It's remarkable. It demands some sort of explanation. Okay, in the results and discussion section at the end of our scientific papers, we scientists tend to use the phrase quite a bit, our data are consistent with whatever it might be, our favorite theory at that time. And so, as a Christian, I would want to say, well, when I look out at the data of science and the data of the universe, it seems to me, pretty consistent with our understanding of God as a personal God who has intentions and purposes for this universe in general and for human lives in particular. Now, the second similarity, I think, between science and faith in a positive way is this interest in the importance of evidence. Last summer I was reading this book, Faith versus Fact by Jerry Coyne. I was doing a review for the Times Literary Supplement, I think it was, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. And in that book, Coyne defines faith as belief without evidence. I think the point here is, no serious theologian has ever understood faith in this way. So I think you've really got a sort of tilting at windmills really going on here. I mean, all historical faiths make historical claims about events that are supported by evidence, and clearly Christianity makes claims about the life, death and resurrection of Christ. I mean, either they're true or they're not, and so forth. Last summer I was speaking at a conference in Amsterdam, the Free University, and the chair of the philosophy department was telling me the story. He said recently they'd had a Dutch atheist who published an article in a newspaper claiming that Jesus had never lived. And so he said, well, what was interesting was the next week, I think it was a weekly newspaper, the next week they had a whole bunch of atheists writing into the same newspaper, people who were historians and classicists and so on, saying, come on, you know, everybody knows that Jesus existed. I mean, what you think about him is something different, but let's not beat about the bush here. Christian faith is absolutely based on the historical evidence for Christ, and certainly the atheist academics were willing to weigh in and make that point pretty clear. The third and last, very briefly, point I want to make, the similarity between science and faith, is a shared commitment to falsifiability, which might surprise you if you know a little bit about the philosophy of science. Karl Popper, one of the famous philosophers of science of the latter half of the 20th century, famously tried to make falsifiability as a kind of demarcation line between science and non-science. We all know it's more complicated than that, but his view was, and has a lot going for it, in principle, can we find data that will count against this theory? If we can't find, in principle, any data that will do that, then it's not really part of science. I find it very intriguing in that respect to read this passage. This is 1 Corinthians 15. This is the Apostle Paul writing his letter to the church in Corinth, either AD 54 or AD 55. And basically saying, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless. Useless, so is your faith. If the dead are not raised, wrote Paul, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Come on, let's all go home. Let's all go home. If Jesus isn't risen from the dead, we're wasting our time, basically. It's very clear. The reason I find that interesting is, after all, it was only 20 years after the purported event that Paul was writing that. And had the body been embalmed and sitting in a grave in Jerusalem, it's very easy to find it. And for the family of Jesus to recognize the body and so on. I mean, he was really laying his faith on the line in a way we can't do today. I'm not suggesting we can do that today. We're so distant from that. Paul wasn't. He was right there. Okay. And so I think what we can do is sort of enter into the empirical thought processes of that early church community and think about how they went about things. So science, friend or foes? Well, as you can see, I think on the whole they're friends. There have been times in the history of science, occasionally when they've been foes, they've had little squabbles. I have to say personally, in my 4 decades in the scientific research community, I've never found them to be in opposition to each other. I've very much found them to be friends. I want to leave you tonight with a quote from Francis Collins, who is now the director of the National Institutes for Health in USA. It's 19 institutes, the biggest funding agency in the world, actually, of science. He was actually an atheist till his late 20s. He started reading and thinking and became a Christian, and then he ended up heading up the great project to sequence the human genome. Now, as I say, he's director of the National Institute for Health. When he was still sequencing the human genome, when that was actively going in collaboration with the Sanger Institute, he wrote this. He said, the work of a scientist involved in this project, particularly a scientist, has the joy of also being a Christian, as a work of discovery, which can also be a form of worship. As a scientist, one of the most exhilarating experiences is to learn something that no human has understood before. To have a chance to see the glory of creation, the intricacy of art, the beauty of it is really an experience not to be matched. Scientists who do not have a personal faith in God also undoubtedly experience the exhilaration of discovery. But to have that joy of discovery mixed together with the joy of worship is truly a powerful moment for a Christian who's also a scientist, close quote. Well, I have to say, those are my sentiments entirely. Thank you very much for listening this evening. Thank you.